the locked playground. When Amelia moved to the small town of Westbridge, she didn't expect to find herself living next to an abandoned playground. Every time she looked out her window, she saw the rusted swings swaying in the wind, the merry-go-round frozen in a perpetual tilt, and a slide with peeling paint that seemed to whisper of forgotten laughter. The locals told her to ignore it. "The playground's been locked up for decades," said Mrs. Carver, her elderly neighbor. "Nothing good ever happens there." One chilly October evening, curiosity got the better of Amelia. She grabbed a flashlight and her coat, heading to the padlocked gate. To her surprise, the lock was already undone, hanging loosely on the chain. She hesitated before stepping inside. The air seemed heavier within the playground, the once faint creaks of the equipment now eerily amplified. Amelia noticed something strange near the merry-go-round. Small footprints in the dirt. They were fresh, yet no children had been seen near the playground for years. She followed the trail to the swings, where one seat was moving rhythmically, as if someone unseen were gently pushing it. Suddenly, a child's laugh echoed through the air. Amelia spun around, her flashlight catching a fleeting glimpse of a figure darting behind the slide. "Hello!" she called out, her voice trembling. There was no answer, only the sound of faint giggles. As she approached the slide, she felt an overwhelming sense of dread. She climbed the ladder, peering down the hollow chute. It was pitch black inside, far darker than it should have been. Then something cold wrapped around her ankle and yanked. She screamed as she was pulled into the slide, tumbling into a suffocating void. When Amelia awoke, she was back in her bedroom, but everything was wrong. The world outside her window was distorted. The playground loomed larger, the equipment now shiny and new. Children with hollow eyes and twisted smiles played silently, their movements jerky and unnatural. One by one, they turned to look at her. Amelia's scream was swallowed by the silence of Westbridge as the playground's gate locked once more. The forgotten tunnel. The small town of Evergreen had a secret, buried deep beneath its picturesque streets. Hidden away in the woods was an entrance to an old railway tunnel, long abandoned and sealed off after a series of tragic accidents. Locals referred to it as the Forgotten Tunnel, and few dared to go near it. For Kevin, a college student visiting his grandparents, the tunnel was an irresistible mystery. One afternoon, Kevin and his dog Max ventured into the woods. The entrance to the tunnel was overgrown with ivy, but the steel door was ajar, as if inviting him inside. Against his better judgment, Kevin stepped through, flashlight in hand. The air inside was damp and heavy, carrying a metallic tang. Max hesitated, whining softly, but Kevin coaxed him forward. Graffiti covered the walls, faded warnings blending with crude drawings. The further they went, the colder it became. Kevin noticed strange markings on the floor, symbols he didn't recognize, arranged in a spiraling pattern. Suddenly, Max growled, his hackles raised. Kevin turned his flashlight to where the dog was staring, only to see shadows moving unnaturally along the tunnel walls. "Is someone there?" Kevin called out, his voice echoing. The only response was a low, guttural whisper that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Max barked and bolted down the tunnel, disappearing into the darkness. Panicking, Kevin chased after him, the beam of his flashlight flickering. He found Max at a dead end, growling at a hole in the ground. A faint light emanated from the opening, accompanied by the sound of distant voices. Kevin peered inside and saw what looked like a subterranean room, filled with shadowy figures moving in a slow, ritualistic dance. Before he could react, hands, pale and skeletal, reached out from the hole, grabbing at his legs. Kevin screamed and stumbled back, dropping his flashlight. In the dim light, he saw the figures climbing out of the hole, their empty eye sockets fixed on him. Kevin turned and ran, Max following close behind. The tunnel seemed to stretch endlessly, the exit always just out of reach. Behind them, the whispers grew louder, forming incoherent chants. Just as Kevin felt his strength fading, he burst through the tunnel's entrance and into the woods. When he looked back, the door was closed and overgrown with ivy once more. Kevin never spoke of what he saw, but he never returned to Evergreen. The town's secret remained buried, but Kevin knew the tunnel was far from forgotten. The Harvest Festival. In the remote town of Pine Hollow, the annual Harvest Festival was a cherished tradition. Every October, locals gathered to celebrate with food, music, and games. But among the festivities was an unspoken rule: never stay past midnight. Tourists found it strange, but the locals were adamant, claiming it was for safety. Ellie and her friends, newcomers to Pine Hollow, saw it as an opportunity to debunk a local legend. "It's just a bunch of superstitions," Ellie said, snapping a selfie with the festival's towering straw effigy, known as the Harvest Sentinel. The effigy's hollow eyes seemed to follow her as she moved. As the clock neared midnight, the once bustling square emptied out. Vendors packed their stalls, and families hurried home, leaving the sentinel looming over an eerily quiet festival ground. Ellie and her friends stayed behind, setting up a camera to capture what they believed would be nothing more than a deserted fairground. The first sign of trouble came when the wind picked up, carrying with it a low, mournful hum. The lights strung across the square began to flicker, casting long, distorted shadows. Ellie's friend Jake pointed to the sentinel. "Did that thing just move?" "Don't be ridiculous," Ellie said, though her voice wavered. She glanced at the effigy, and for a moment, she could swear its straw arms had shifted. Suddenly, the camera tripod toppled over, the lens shattering. A deep, guttural growl echoed through the square. Ellie turned to see the sentinel stepping down from its pedestal, its once lifeless body now lumbering toward them. Its movements were jerky, but purposeful, and its hollow eyes glowed with an unnatural light. The friends scattered, but the sentinel was faster. It snatched Jake, lifting him effortlessly into the air before vanishing into the shadows. Ellie and the others ran toward the woods, the sentinel's growls echoing behind them. One by one, her friends disappeared, their screams swallowed by the night. Ellie tripped over a root, her phone skidding out of reach. She turned to see the sentinel towering over her, its glowing eyes burning into her soul. Just as it reached for her, the church bells rang out, signaling midnight. The sentinel froze, retreating to its pedestal. The square returned to silence, but Ellie knew she would never escape the horrors of that night. She left Pine Hollow the next morning, the town's unspoken rule forever etched in her mind. The Lake of Shadows. In the secluded woods of Maine, Blackwater Lake shimmered like a dark mirror under the moonlight. The locals warned travelers to stay away, spinning tales of strange disappearances and ghostly apparitions. For Mia, a photographer seeking inspiration, the lake was an irresistible challenge. On a crisp autumn morning, she set out with her gear, determined to capture the eerie beauty of the place. The journey to the lake was uneventful, though the path was overgrown and silent, devoid of the usual forest sounds. As she reached the shore, she was struck by the unnatural stillness of the water, its surface unervingly smooth. Mia began snapping photos, the camera clicking rhythmically. Through her lens, the lake seemed alive, rippling ever so slightly despite the lack of wind. She noticed something odd in her shots. Faint shapes beneath the surface, blurred and indistinct. Adjusting her focus, she gasped as one of the shapes became clearer. A pale, humanoid figure staring up at her with hollow eyes. A sudden splash broke her concentration. She looked up to see ripples spreading across the water. "Hello?" she called out, scanning the shoreline. There was no response, only the growing sense that she was being watched. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the atmosphere grew oppressive. Mia decided to leave, but the path she had come down seemed to vanish, swallowed by the encroaching darkness. Panic set in as she realized she was trapped. The lake began to change. Wisps of mist rose from its surface, curling into the shapes of figures. They floated toward her, their features indistinct but undeniably human. Mia backed away, clutching her camera as the apparitions drew closer, their murmurs blending into a chilling chorus. Suddenly, a cold hand gripped her ankle. She screamed, looking down to see a skeletal arm emerging from the soil. More hands followed, clawing their way out of the earth around her. She stumbled backward, dropping her camera into the lake. The last thing Mia saw was the water rising unnaturally, forming a towering wave that loomed over her. As it crashed down, she was engulfed in icy darkness. Her screams echoed briefly before being silenced. Days later, hikers found Mia's belongings near the lake, but there was no sign of her. Locals claimed the lake had claimed another soul, adding her story to the haunting legends of Blackwater Lake.